My dear friends, this Gospel, which is the last of the liturgical year, reminds us of the risk. Take heed to yourselves, lest your hearts be weighed down. Now, what are the things that the Lord tells us are going to weigh us down? Dissipation. We can say multiplicity, leakage of energy. Pope Benedict, a few years ago, in one of his teachings, came out with this: activism leads to a hardening of the heart. And he was indicating that it is even amongst pious souls a disease which takes away from the essential intimacy. The Lord goes on, drunkenness, translate, anything which dulls the intelligence and the reason. That can be a multiplicity of messages on the air, because we are dulled by a large number of words and not the time to take them in. It can be also in the form of many human beings all the time draining our energy and feeding us with messages, all the time with people. I'm reminded of a comment that an English Benedictine made one time in conversation years ago. He mentioned, we're always talking, always talking. And what he meant by that was that by the very life of the English Benedictine, even though one was in a state of intimacy with the Lord, the mouth was always open. And it is a mode which is not easy to handle if one is seeking intimacy with the Lord. Therefore, we have to limit the damage. A concrete way is this: we do not have to always engage with every word. We can listen and let the other person converse. We lose all our energy if we are always interacting, at every sentence finding an answer. There is a contemplative way and mode of engaging even in conversation, and the Lord is present in that conversation on condition that it is under His will, that that conversation is sent by His providence and permission, and not unduly sought by ourselves out of context. That, by the way, gives us a certain serenity. It gives us that knowledge that as long as we're in the will of God, we are not losing intimacy. We don't have to. The Lord wants us there, and He is to be found there where His will is, and not in another ideal of our own fabrication. The other, and cares of this life. We have to take care. We have to be prepared and prepare. That is, living well the present in function of a prudential judgment for the future. And if that is not made in time, the future will suffer, and it will be a bad present. But it does not mean that one loses the grace of the present so as to live there by anticipation. The cares of life can be overdone. We are not God. We receive a certain amount of things, and knowing that does give us already a certain liberty. Having said that, we tend to increase the cares. We tend to undertake and take on ourselves more than actually we need to. That is something one sees everywhere in the monastic life and also in the lay life. People are doing too many things. Now, to get back to what I mentioned with regard to choosing to have many words, that is an initial choice, both in a monastic situation. We do not have to recreate ourselves with many artificial words pumped at us by any mode. or in the lay life, we do not need to recreate ourselves with what takes away from our desert. On the contrary, where there is no structure, we have to be more energetic about maintaining that quality of simplicity, because we devastate our peace by too many things. And the consequence is that that day come upon you suddenly like a snare. In this very chapel, with the help of Richard, we had to use heavy artillery to get rid of an intruder, a rodent, and the snare worked perfectly well. He was interested in the cheese, but he was caught and obliterated forevermore. We too can be caught with cheese, whatever it may be, taking away from the optic. One day I was going to confession way back in the days when I was doing classics in Aberystwyth and living in a Carmelite house seminary, and the prior, when he would take us in for confession, by the very fact that he had in his cell a reminder that we were not here for keeps, helped us to confess well. And would open the door would open, and there would be vibrating behind the door his friend Rudolph. Rudolph was a skeleton, a rubber skeleton, and he would start to vibrate, especially when the door was in movement. And occasionally the prior would talk to Rudolph and say, "Hello, Rudolph. I'll be with you one of these days, Rudolph." And it was always a reminder that actually we are not here for keeps, and therefore our confessions are, if you like, the insurance policy. That should it be today, I am ready to go. But there is another mode of being prepared, and it is this. The desert as such. All the founders, all the great charismatics, all the great preachers and pastors of souls have had this double dynamic. The one interior and the other exterior. I will take just two for a few seconds. One is St. Alphonsus. He was, as you know, somebody who had a powerful experience as a result of an apparent disaster, a failure in his legal career. He made a blunder in professional terms, and the Lord used it to make him orientate his energies elsewhere. He found a solitary place, and like all these great founders, he met his God, first of all, in this risk of being worked upon without obstacle in the desert. Now, what happened there was this. He, without knowing it, was experiencing what, for instance, the great fathers of the desert had done before, e.g. Benedict himself in his Sacro Eremo, or rather Sacro Speco in Subiaco. Going further back than Benedict himself, we have a case where there was somebody who was a tutor to the imperial princes of Constantinople. This is more than 1400 years ago. The same dynamic is at work. One day, good as he was, he received a serious wake-up call from an angel who admonished him. If you wish to be saved, fly into solitude. Observe silence and repose in God, by always keeping yourself in His presence. Now, there is first of all an evasion, fleeing. There is a limitation of multiplicity, silence, and there is a consequent entering into a mode of rest, repose in God, which then leads to this positive element, which I would leave with you, by always keeping yourself in His presence. Now, do you see that that is the key? If we are in His presence, we take His manifestation as it comes to us, the manifestation in concrete terms of His will, in what His providence permits right now. So I rest upon it without preference, and it gives me a certain freedom. But He's asking me to focus on Him and not on that. Focus on Him, and whatever we are doing, if we're in His will, we are equal to ourselves and to His will. We are not up and down, because His presence is there in His will. Used to a soft life, this most cultivated man took these words seriously. He fled the court, went out into the desert, and became a monk. Ultimately, he saved his soul and became a saint, because he flew into solitude. This was the great Arsenius. Now, let us take a jump. St. Teresa of Avila. Oh, how gladly would I speak to many souls, but the world makes such a noise in their hearts that my voice cannot be heard. Oh, that they would retire a little from the world. These were the words of the Lord Himself spoken to this great saint. Retire from the world. Just this last week, through Providence, I had that experience in a place where there was the sound of silence. One could hear one's voice and one's thought and taste the written word without interruption all day. It is a different mode, and in it I realized what we have lost. St. Alphonsus, going now much closer again in time, had the same experience. Now, what he did afterwards had an impact insofar as he took that desert with him, and the order which he founded had this motto: Carthusians in the monastery and missionaries on the field. And this element of being in a state of desert, and therefore receptivity to the maximum, was what gave them their power in the word. And they used to have, until the council, a lay brother of theirs kneeling before the cross, the crucifix, while the preacher was preaching in the pulpit. And they would have an effect on souls because they said precisely what they needed to hear. And they had such an effect on the people that they had a large number of conversions wherever they went. Now, this is something which I would like to just mention right now in this optic of what missions are about. If the true issue is, in the course of a week of mission, not mentioned, it is not having its effect. This has been the experience of all those engaged in preaching in any order of preachers in Christian history. Another great founder I would like to mention for a second is St. Dominic. Why? The Lord gave his testimony as to why it was so efficacious. St. Catherine, our own Catherine of Siena, knew this. The Lord dialogued with her. And the Lord himself had these words to say about his own chosen soul. As my natural son sent out his disciples, so this adopted son sent out his friars. Therefore, as my natural son is my word, so this adopted son is the bearer and announcer of my word. Do you see what's happening there? They are not giving themselves. They are directly links between heaven and earth by giving the word of the Lord, which has its own effect. For this purpose, by an extraordinary gift from me, he and his friars have been enabled to understand the truth of my words, and never to forsake this truth. You see what's happening there. The Lord raised up this order to defend the truth, an order to defend the truth, an order of preachers, the Lord blessing and indeed raising up himself in the first person. Why? Because the life that the Lord himself was inspiring was a complete balance between receiving and giving. I remember in Rome, because I was living with the Dominicans, in the morning we would sing the office, and I would be next to Father Paul Murray, who was a great lecturer in Rome, great director of Psalms. In fact, he used to sleep opposite me, and we were next to each other in choir, and we would sing together the office as cantors. But then what would happen? After the end of the office, he would be in prayer for half an hour every morning before taking a cup of coffee. That's what made him and his likes so efficacious. It was a word received and not just fabricated in the mind. The Lord honours those who honour him, and if we're doing our own thing, we'll have our own human result. Further, as my natural son devoted all his life and actions to the salvation of souls, so my adopted son Dominic directed all his efforts and powers to the task of freeing souls from the snares of vice and error. Vice is linked to error, and if people are not being told the truth, they will be in vice and therefore prone to the attacks of Satan, because a mission or any sermon has to be a healing experience in which the Lord, through the power of the Word, influences the will and therefore reigns. The feel-good factor acts on a very superficial level and leaves the soul in illusion. Only the return to complete sacramental grace is what the Lord wants. Any fiddling around on the outside is our own thing. This was the main reason why he founded and developed his order, zeal for souls, what the Lord said on the cross, Sitio, I first. Catherine of Siena used to talk about crunching souls, eating souls. She was hungry for souls. I tell you that in almost all his works he resembled my natural son, and so, as you now can see, the image of his body bore a great resemblance to the image of the body of my most sacred only Son. People transmitting goodness, people in their eyes transmitting the Lord's healing gaze. In the case of Dominic, his contemporaries said this: he only spoke either to God or of God. I conclude there, that is something we can take with us. If we go through this next liturgical year giving off unnecessary energy and syllables all the time, we will miss the appointment. And no matter how much we will be trying to do for the Lord, we will be doing our own thing. If, on the contrary, we select and elect to have elected silence, a flight away from and towards, and at the risk of letting ourselves be worked upon and gazed upon, even then the slightest word coming from us, indeed the slightest gaze coming from our eyes, will have its effect because it will be his. At the same time, doubly enforced, the Lord reigning, the Lord himself nudging, the Lord being the prime mover. I conclude, let us in this year ahead insist upon 1 hour, if possible, in some shape or form, if not in one go, at least in 2, of just being worked upon, gazing and loving and waiting for the first move.